I'm very pleased to welcome our second speaker, Emily Echessa. Emily has been working for over 20 years in education and international development, and she's currently the Senior Education Advisor at Save the Children UK, where she works particularly in the area of girls' education. So thank you, Emily. And I think, do you want to share your screen? Is that right? Can you?
I think I'll introduce my colleague first before I share my screen. And
Okay,
before we
sorry.
share our screen, if you can show the film that we shared with you, the 1-minute film.
Right, let me see if I can do that.
So as you're doing that, I can introduce Bati. Bati, are you there?
Yes, hi. Hi, everyone.
Can you introduce yourself, Bati?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Delighted to join you all, and I'll be supporting Emily in this next presentation. My name is Bati Mepani. I'm the global lead of in children's participation within Save the Children. And here we'd like you to now just spend a few moments hearing directly from some of the children that we work with. Thank you.
All right, let's see if this works. I'm a bit nervous about it.
You can enlarge the screen as well. Thank you.
أحب أصير صيدلانية وبنفس الوقت أضلني متابع قضايا المرأة وأكتب عنها أشعار ومقالات. أعمل كرلة سلير باجم. اطلع مهندسة كمبيوتر يا عمي مهندسة معمار. بس أكبر بدي أطلع دكتورة أطفال. مستقبلي مهندسة دكتور. I'm going to be the boss of the company. I'm going to change the world.
Thank you very much, Judith. So I'll just share our screen here before we start. And do let me know if you can see the screen now.
Yes, we can see the screen, Emily.
Okay. There we go. All right, so to begin with, I'm going to hand over to Bati. I think we need to move back. Yep. I'm going to hand over to Bati to take us through the children's voices and the different messages that are coming from the global level. And then I will take over and take you through a project level needs assessment that we've conducted for girls during COVID and the actions that we've taken thereafter, so that you can hear girls' voices from all the different directions. Bati, over to you. And we've changed our title, as you can see there, to reflect the work that we are showing. And the pictures you are seeing are for girls in Mozambique.
Great, thank you, Emily. As you know, one of the key values of Save the Children is really listening to the voices of children, and in particular, the voices of some of the world's most marginalized and most deprived children. And I really would like to build from Yumiko's presentation here. Save the Children last year undertook a comprehensive survey of children and families during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. It was one of the largest surveys to date, where we had just under 14,000 children participating and around 31,500 parents and caregivers participating. It was an online survey with some face-to-face qualitative focus sessions being run. The children who participated, majority of them were part of our programs, our projects. So here you were hearing directly from the voices and the expertise of children who are some of the world's most poorest children or most deprived or marginalized groups of children. This included children who live on the streets, children with disabilities, children who are refugees, children living in conflict, children in rural areas or in urban settings. It really brought together the voices of some of the girls who are marginalised from our societies. And it was a powerful survey which brought to the forefront the impact of COVID-19 upon children's lives. As we move through the slides, you'll see a number of quotes appearing directly from children. Here, we have a young girl from Burkina Faso who talks about part of the survey. We asked children, what would your messages be for leaders? And here, we need to go to school. We need additional support and catch-up classes to make it. We ask for governments to spend more money to make sure that we can continue learning while at home by providing radios, TVs, and internet learning. They must make sure that children in rural areas and from poor families also get to learn. We want to see mobile libraries passing in our communities, delivering books for us to learn. That's a young girl from Zambia. Children, as I mentioned, children around the world really shared some powerful insights. Another young girl from Lebanon shared, take care of us because our situation is only getting worse. Children, it's not a favor. We're not doing a favor for children when we provide, when we ensure they have access to learning, when we ensure they are protected from violence, when we ensure that their rights are being upheld. It's not a favor for children. It's their right. They're entitled to accessing quality education. They're entitled to being protected from abuse and harm. They're entitled from not dropping out of school. They're entitled to receiving basic services. The UNCRC is a human rights framework that places an obligation upon states to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of children. The state is obligated with an overall responsibility to make sure provisions are made for children, including the voices and expertise of children to be part of the solution and not just some problem to be fixed. The SDGs are at risk of being compromised, are at risk of the incredible work that has taken place for over these past 10, 20, 30 years. We're at risk of reversing some of those great efforts that have already been made. And as our colleague earlier, Miko, mentioned, we are seeing millions of children being denied their rights, millions of children being left behind. We are at risk of not reaching the 2030 promises, the 2030 agenda promises through the SDGs. We promised children that we would end poverty in all its forms everywhere. We're totally off track. We promised children that we would ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. There's been some progress, but it's been so slow. And we promised children that we would achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. This remains unreached. And our SDGs impacted by COVID-19, these inequalities and inequities have been exacerbated. Almost half the world's poor children, without explicit recognition and dedicated efforts to address child poverty, it will be difficult to meet these SDGs or any of the other SDGs. It's really important as we go through these presentations and these presentations that children's rights, our obligation to children, and investing in children is part of a human rights framework. I just want to hand over at this stage to Emily, who will just share a little bit more around what do we actually mean by child poverty? What do we mean by inclusive and equitable education? Plus, Emily will share a very practical example of some of our work in Mozambique. Thank you.
Thank you, Bati, for that global framing. That was excellent. I think in terms of Save the Children, we've published a lot of reports on child poverty. We've published reports on education, and we've gone back to those reports just to bring you a glimpse of what we are talking about in terms of child poverty. We see child poverty as where children have stark deprivations in the realizations of their daily needs. They are exposed to damaging failures and protections, and they have certain uncertain access to food, inadequate shelter, social services, including education, health, and with damaging effects of social inclusion. The whole issue of insecurity, risks of shocks. We've seen children go through, for example, Cyclone Idai in Mozambique. We've seen conflicts in different countries like DRC, Nigeria, where girls were abducted just the other day before the light. And we have seen children being trafficked and going through the different climate change and environmental hazards. The whole child poverty is underpinned by inequalities, from economic inequalities, social inequalities, social justice inequalities, including social inclusion. And these are reinforced by social inclusion and biases in our service delivery and diverse forms of discrimination. So child poverty is multidimensional, as my previous speakers have spoken about, and as is reflected in the SDGs. And this links very well with education, because if we are talking of exclusion and inequalities as reinforcing child poverty, when we zero down to education, we have defined education in Save the Children, looking at both at basic education from ECCD 0 to 6 to 8, all the way to primary education and secondary education. Save the Children defines inclusive education as education that enables all children to learn together with support for their own individual needs, but also looking at equity and not only focusing at equality, because we have to make sure that the fairness aspects is adhered to. This is a picture of girls in Sierra Leone who are studying in one of the projects that we are working with. I'm going to take you through this, the work we've done through this project and the needs assessment we've done last year in July, just as the COVID-19 pandemic hit and schools started closing. In Mozambique, we work in 3 provinces where we are implementing girls' education. This is Tete, Manik, and Gaza. We work in 140 schools, primary schools, 35 secondary schools. And we also support distance learning centers that we have set up in primary schools, about 75 distance learning centers. And we also have what we call community-based education. So we did a thorough needs assessment initially before COVID in 2018, where we found out that poverty, early marriage, underage pregnancies. Mozambique has one of the highest early marriage and underage pregnancies rates in the world. Safety within and around school, and community perceptions and attitudes towards education were a huge issue. On the supply side, distances to schools kept girls away from schools, and also boys. Limited places in the schools, they had to go on a quota system if they have done well, or depending on what districts they come from. And the whole issue of the quality of learning and teacher absenteeism, the language of instruction as we've had before, and lack of textbooks. So we came up with this graphic representation of how you'd imagine our intervention would look like. And where you see the 3 girls walking in, we started in 2013 at primary school level, where we were supporting girls to access education, but also a quality level of education. And 2018, we continued with the same girls that we had worked with earlier to transition to upper primary school. And where you are seeing withdrawn primary schools, we are transitioning the girls to upper primary because we realize they drop out a lot at grade 5. And within upper primary, once they complete grade 7, they drop out a lot without transitioning to secondary because of all the reasons I've highlighted. So we came up with different pathways. We have 3 pathways. There are few girls who move on to regular secondary education, which is on the upper part. There are few girls that move on to distance learning because the distance learning centers were based in the secondary. So we brought the distance learning to the primary school level so that the girls can transition there. And we created another pathway called community education, because girls were dropping out a lot at primary level and lower secondary. due to pregnancies, work, or different reasons, to give them a 6-month program that would enable them to sit for exams again and either go back to secondary or go back to upper primary. And that was the pathway that we were implementing until COVID hit. When COVID hit last year, schools had just opened in March. So we opened a few weeks and then we closed again, and we had to do a rapid needs assessment to find out what was the effect of the school closures, what were the other alternatives we could use to ensure that we are not just school based, because now children were learning from home, and what learning environments the children had at home. Uh, our rapid assessment looked at mixed methods, reviewing secondary data, collecting data from girls themselves, the caregivers, the teachers, and looking at key informants, and with key informants mainly talking through the phones because there were movement restrictions. Children were banned from leaving their homes. Adults were not allowed to mix in more than a certain number. And we also did a purposive sampling. So we looked at about 298 children, sample size, including children, caregivers, teachers, and key informants, about 188 female and 110 male in total. For girls, we looked at more girls because this is a girls' education project, about 103 girls versus 27 men, just to compare whether the boys and girls were going through the same. The assessment demographics here is to show you at provincial level, how did we pick the purposive sample? So we picked more girls in all the 3 provinces and a certain percentage of boys, with more girls coming from Gaza, more and boys as well, and very few boys in Tet, which is a more rural remote area. When we looked at the sample, the ages of the sample size, they range from 14 to 20 years. So on average, we saw the average age was about 14 years for the girls and boys. We also looked at the marital status of these children, and mainly the girls. About 5.4% of the girls were married and they had children. 2 of them were mothers and they attended secondary education. Between those 2, one was married, one was not. The other girls who were children attended the distance learning. And also looking at the ages of the girls who were married and had children, they were between 19 and 20. However, they had their kids when they were below 18. So there was no girl attending primary school who was married or had a child. And that's why you can see the highest number bar where they have no children. We also looked at the status of disability, the indicative using the Washington group of questions. And we had 8.5 who had difficulties in seeing, 7% being female, 9.2 had difficulties hearing, 9.2 difficulties walking or climbing stairs, 8.5 trouble remembering or concentrating, and 9.2 indicated difficulty in communicating even while using their local language or usual mother tongue language. Among the caregivers, 19%, 25% being female, also indicated they had a form of disability. So from the data that we collected, the overall analysis or the voices we had from the children and their caregivers and teachers was that all the target respondents highlighted the main impact is the loss of learning time for their children, especially the potential loss of the whole academic year. And mainly children really talked about their anxiety in terms of their future. They were worried about the next steps, especially those who are going to sit for exams, the grade 7, grade 10s, grade 12, and whether they will regress in terms of learning outcomes if they stay out of school for a long time. So the children were really worried and wondering what would happen to them. We also looked on average where the children came from in the schools we were supporting and how many there were in the households. So about an average of 3 students, a ratio of 1 boy to 1 girl per household, used to attend school before COVID, which is quite good. And the most common per household was 2 children attending. But with school closures, they were all staying at home. And as you can see, majority of the children indicated that they are continuing learning from home. Most married girls, unfortunately, said they were not continuing because their responsibilities had increased. Most children learning from home were using exercises and notes that they had been sent by their teachers or by the school, or they were listening to the community radios or the national radio. And the national curriculum had also been stepped down to the community radios for those who had radios. And a significant proportion were not learning from home, which is about 22% of the girls and boys. For those who continued learning by level of education, majority of them, 15.4%, are in primary school with significantly lower proportions, 3.8 in secondary, 3.1 are attending distance learning, though it should be noted that the proportion of representation is not equally distributed across the 3 pathways, that is secondary, regular secondary distance learning, and primary education. For the CBE, learning completely stopped because a proportion of the CBEs were held in the primary schools, and when schools were closed, the CBEs were also closed because they include a life skills component where girls learn different skills like cookery, baking, tailoring, and the different other trades. Provision of learning materials, about, as per the chart below, 65.8 of the children indicated that they had received learning materials from the schools, with a significant proportion indicating that they had not received any materials. When the same question was asked to the caregivers, they also said that about children were receiving materials, but a few of them said that they were not. And we feel that the learning materials specifically, as much as they imply exercise and notebooks at that point in time, there were other materials that parents were also providing other than what was being given by the school, but not all the parents. Then the teacher support across educational levels from the children and parents. 19% of children indicated to have received support from the teachers, and 19.4% of parents also shared the same feedback. And we felt that this is related to clarifications, mainly on what they are learning, and through face-to-face interactions in the few instances that the teachers were able to visit the houses and support the learners. For the teachers, for the parents, some parents said that the teachers were not providing enough support. And we could see some contradictions between what the teachers and the children and the parents were saying. And when they were probed further, this was seen to be the expectation of parents for teachers to be seen on a daily basis. But teachers felt that they were visiting some of the children, but not on a daily basis. As you can see, 14 teachers visited about 14 girls, 58% of the overall reach on average within a week. So 24 learners in the past week. 79% of the teachers indicated to have provided support during COVID. All teachers from TET indicated to have been providing support, while some parents would say maybe not. And this was an average of 2 times a week. And the support is mainly provision of learning exercises and clarifications. Also to say that the government had come up with workbooks that we as a project helped distribute. We also looked at the spaces that children were working in the school. And a lot of children say they didn't have safe spaces either to play or to learn, about 49%. And 40% of these were girls. And we felt that this could be because parents are more protective over girls, but they also have more household chores than boys to run. We looked at the access to radios, and 40.7% said that they were able to access, they were not able to access any radio across the provinces. The most affected majority, about 75%, do not have access to a radio in Tet, which is a more further rural remote province compared to Gaza, which is close to Maputo. Then we also looked at the use of radio. About 15% indicated using radio all the time, while 47% of all, 37% being girls indicated using radios. But also there were others who had never used radios. And we probed further why they were not using radios, and we realized that even where girls had radios, they had the access, but they had no control. Either the parents would take the radios to the farm were to listen to while they were sewing or working in the farm, or the girls were not allowed to touch the radio. Usefulness of radio content, you can see from the chart there. In the primary education, a lot of children say that it was useful. Quite a small number said it was not useful. In the secondary education, even lower numbers said, or percentages said, it was not useful, but majority said it was very useful. And then also in the distance learning centers, because they are used to self-study and all, they said it was very useful. And then the table below provides proportions that affirm to have received the information, literacy and numeracy through radio, child protection issues and psychosocial support, sexual reproductive health, and COVID-19 information. So children, all the past 6.2%, more girls and boys said that they were listening to all these programs on the radio and they had learned a lot. Access to mobile phones, we also looked at that, and you can see that girls do not have that high access compared to boys, although still more girls said that they had no access, but also a high number of boys. Safety at home during COVID, a lot of girls and boys said they felt safe, but when you look at the proportion of girls who say they don't feel safe compared to boys is also slightly higher than the boys. Child well-being at home, we also looked at that. And again, girls, as we said earlier, said that they were facing some child abuse issues, violence, and either verbal or physical or different types of abuse that you can look at in the report. Then those who knew or had knowledge of reporting channels, we can see there were more boys who had more information, but also girls proportionately had some information on that. The whole issue of access to menstrual hygiene, girls had received materials, but not all of them had received the materials. About,
Sorry, Emily,
yep.
Emily, I'm sorry to interrupt because this
Oh
is
yeah, it's
so.
20 minutes. Okay.
But if
So
you,
I
if,
can stop
no, I don't
there
want to
so that
stop
if
you
you
in
have
mid.
any,
I don't want to stop you in mid flow. If you want to just take another minute to wrap up.
just to conclude, yeah, actually we're almost
Thank you.
done. So uh, I've been through that. Relevance of mess. Oh, am I going backward? Okay, sorry. I think I'm going backward. So as you can see, we looked at all different dimensions of child poverty and the issues affecting them, and we got some recommendations to continue supporting the learners while at home, extending the distance learning support, also advocating for government relaxation for children to do their module tests while they're at home because they have to take them at the centers. We also supported, got recommendations on SRH and MHM, menstrual hygiene management, to make sure that we are not only providing recyclable pads, but also not only disposable, but also recyclable or a combination of the two. And most of the materials we use for pads were also used to provide the local tailors to make masks and different support materials for the girls. We did some adaptations based on those findings, and you can see them there, enhancing the learning skills for girls, providing more remedial classes, supporting teachers' well-being, because we also realized the teachers were facing different trauma and psychosocial issues. We had a back to school campaign, one of a very good back to school after COVID guidance that was adapted by the government. We extended the radio broadcasting and other activities, including bursaries, vulnerability study, community action groups, and coming up with a vulnerability fund, which we hope to implement. And that's the last statement from Bati.
Yeah, we'll just wrap up. We must accelerate progress and investment in education and social protection schemes for children as critical enablers for achieving the other SDGs. We'll open now for a Q&A and then maybe add a couple of closing points in that section. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both very much. And I'm sorry that we had to sort of finish it because it's such an amazingly helpful presentation to have that level of detail and, you know, to understand the complexity of the issues that you're dealing with. So I'll open it up to questions, and please feel free to put your questions in the chat or to raise your hand. We might just go on for a bit longer and shorten the break slightly if that's okay with everybody, but we will take a break before the next session, so don't worry. Any questions from the audience?
I have a question while perhaps other people are reflecting. Is that okay, Judith?
Yeah, go ahead, Lorella.
It is for Bharti, and it goes back to your recommendations. You said, Bharti, that you estimate that approximately 10 million children will not go back to school after the pandemic. And you're recommending a back to school campaign to engage with government in order to get these children back to school. I wanted to know a little bit more about this. What are the factors that you think will prevent those children going back to school? Is it an exacerbation of poverty, of income deprivation? And what are you concretely doing with the government in order to bring those children back?
Great, thank you for your question there. Yes, there's obviously a number of reasons. Save the Children has launched a global campaign on safe back to school and recognises that very specific recommendations are needed, and there's also guidance continuously being developed to support governments to ensure children can return back safe to school. But we also recognise that the impact of COVID-19 has unleashed an unprecedented crisis that has threatened so many children's lives. We know that some of these children will not return back to school. Some of them may have been forced to get married in that time. Some of them may have forced to migrate or to undertake harmful child labor, for example. We know that some of these children, the impact of COVID-19 upon their lives, upon the livelihoods of those households, has pushed back families and children into even deeper poverty. And we know that for many of these children, basic needs has not reached them. I mean, children, in fact, I have a quote here from a young boy who talks about, poverty causes inequalities, and we can't do or achieve anything tangible since we cannot even afford basic needs such as education. He goes on to talk about corruption and poor mismanagement of government resources that were meant to help uphold children's rights, and recognises that for some children, their rights may never be realised. We have various reports, which I think Emily has put some links to, and we can also share further reports where we call for recommendations directly to governments, but also children themselves have a call for action, which includes protecting current investments in social protection, scaling up further to expand child benefits, making sure provisions to reach children and households who are particularly vulnerable and excluded, including through temporary cash assistance, ensuring that vulnerable households in both rural and urban settings benefit from government social protection systems and other COVID-19 cash assistance and livelihood support, address specific deprivation and vulnerabilities of the most marginalised and deprived households, especially those that have only female adults or only male adults, or have members with disabilities. So some of the recommendations go into some of the root causes linking poverty and the impacts upon children's education, children's learning, and the links back to poverty. And obviously, there's so much scope for further research, there's so much we don't know. But what we have realized is that we really need integrated processes, integrated programs and policies that bring together the different sectors, be it around social protection, child protection, education, for example, working together to really prevent the what could be some of the irreversible damages and consequences of COVID-19 upon generations, today's generation and generations to come.
And in some countries, just to add to what Batia said, for example, in Ethiopia, where Yumiko is, we've just secured over $20 million funding to support school feeding programs in 5 regions of Ethiopia. And we are not just looking at school feeding, we are looking at it from an education, child protection, WASH perspective, and also supporting the homegrown community support structures. We're also making sure that schools are COVID safe, knowing that not all children will come back to school when the schools reopen or as the schools are reopening. And some children will be working from home. So in some countries, we are talking about blended approach where we are supporting children learning at home, but also learning from school. We are training teachers. We have a very good approach called enabling teachers that looks at teachers throughout the cycle of competencies, teacher training, teacher learning circles, and also introducing psychosocial first aid and mental health support and ed tech and other different aspects.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you both. I think we have time for just one more question because we do need to take a break. Yumiko, you've put something in the chat. Do you want to put this, share this with is it a question or this is just on the home growth school food? Yeah,
just a comment, so it's okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, please go on.
I wanted to know what Save the Children does in terms of having a post-colonial approach to the implementation of education, because like I'm doing a master degree in education policy, and we talk a lot about the fact that in a lot of cases, like organizations tend to implement models like Western models of education that don't really have like good results, not even in the West, like we know it, and also that don't really take into consideration like the context, for example, the language, and the teaching is in English, and maybe the material is also in English, and it's like, I'm sorry, it's a really confused thought probably. It's just that I wanted to know, which I'm sure Save the Children like doesn't do, but I wanted to know what the organization does in terms of post-colonial approach.
Yeah, I can take a go, and then Bati can also give you at the global level because she sits at the center. But as Save the Children, we are also looking a lot inwards now and addressing all the issues of decolonization and localization. We have an approach that is newly emerging where a lot of the technical expertise and technical rigor is shifting from the center to the country programs that we are working in. To give you a practical example, having staff that are hired at the local level with the technical expertise to lead different programs and strengthening capacities at those levels as opposed to all the technical assistants sitting at the head office, and making sure that all the projects that and programs that are designed at the country level, with the support of all the children and communities, making sure that the voices of the children are heard, the mothers, the fathers, and the different local leaders, as well as the decentralized and centralized systems. We also have a very good approach on multilingual education. So we do not only focus on foreign languages where we are working in education, we support the different programs we work with to also have books in local languages, or support the teachers to be able to support children using local languages before they transition to the different language of instruction, given the different language of instruction policies in these countries.
Thank you, Emily. I mean, this is a really important question, and I feel like it's not one that can be fully addressed in a couple of minutes. So maybe this is something we can come back to in the plenary. I'm going to suggest that we close it here, and thank you, Emily and Bharti, for really informative and useful session. Thank you both for all your work, and